Welcome to Bad Takes. I'm Laura McGann, the executive editor of Grid, and I'm here with my co-host and contributing editor to Grid, Matthew Yglesias.
Hello.
Hey, Matt.
What's going on?
So, well, I'm excited for this episode. We've got a bad take to talk about. Do you want to set it up for us?
And we did actual research and reporting.
All right, Matt, go ahead. Tell us the bad take. Set up your investigative reporting.
Okay, so a woman named Meg Smaker, she made a documentary that was about a sort of Saudi program that was supposed to rehabilitate terrorists or alleged terrorists. And she specifically is following four Yemeni guys who had been in Guantanamo Bay and then were released into this Saudi program. She sort of tells the story of their time there and what happens to them. This movie showed at the Sundance Film Festival, which, as people may know, like a normal way to get an independent film in front of audiences' eyes is you show it at these film festivals. If it is well received there, usually a distributor will pick it up. She showed the movie at Sundance. It was well received. It got a lot of good reviews from people. But then there was a backlash against it from some Muslim filmmakers, some Middle Eastern filmmakers. They complained a lot about the movie. And ultimately, Sundance wound up apologizing for having aired it, and it hasn't been able to get distribution. We read about this in the New York Times. We were thinking of talking about this discourse, but we actually reached out to the filmmaker, and she was able to share a screener copy with us. So we actually did our homework and have seen the movie and can talk in an informed way, not just discourse about the movie, but actually speak to the film. That being said, the specific take here that I think is not great is the one from Sundance, right? They organized this screening, they put the film on, people see it, people liked it, then there were complaints about it, and now they say, we have been listening to and reflecting on the many perspectives shared around the inclusion of Meg Smaker's documentary film, Jihad Rehab, at our festival in January. As with every film we show, we hope to stimulate conversation and debate that adds value to our civic society. In this case, it is clear that the showing of this film hurt members of our community, in particular individuals from Muslim and Manasa communities, and for that we are deeply sorry. And I think there's a lot of things one could say about like representation in art and film and documentary filmmaking, and that could be valid. But I don't think anything you could say is that having shown this one documentary at a prestigious film festival hurt people in the relevant kind of way that you would need to apologize for. To me, it doesn't make sense, and it's part of a weird, broader cultural trend.
So I think in this case, it'd be useful to run through what the criticism was. Specifically, the major critique was that this was a white filmmaker telling the story of four Muslim men in the context of the war on terror, and that this is a trope that characterizes the entire Muslim world in this context. And Muslim filmmakers were saying Sundance needs to open up to a greater variety of representations of Arabs, Muslims in film. And so that is tricky, right? Like, I think both things could be true, that there should be a broader representation of people in film. Muslims in film, the people who are making them. But in this case, the story was about four men who were imprisoned in Guantanamo for 15 years. They never received a trial, and they endured, just really terrible conditions. And to me, as a journalist, I see that through the lens of journalism and history, and I see that as important. That this is not, to me, necessarily about pigeonholing a whole group of people into a framework of terrorism, but really a moment for, as an American watching this, thinking, it was also accused of being American propaganda, and I didn't feel that way. I felt the story is complex and there's ambiguities, but hearing these men describe their treatment at Guantanamo. It was really the first time I've heard actual men who were there describe their experiences. And she does a lot of it through the art that they make at this program. And I felt ashamed as an American to hear this. And I have thought about the film a lot since, and just that is a nagging feeling for me of just shame. And my identity as an American was really, I found it important and useful to me.
So here's what I thought when I dug into this open letter that was put together by mostly Muslim filmmakers involved in the documentary. I was anticipating, honestly, more focus on pure representational issues relative to what they actually say. And when you read the statement, I mean, I think that they actually have a sort of narrow political complaint about the movie, which is okay. I mean, I have lots of narrow political complaints about things. But in this case, like, I think their complaint is just sort of wrong, right? So, like, they go over and over again through this, and they say that, you know, it's bad that the movie portrays these men, and more broadly the men in the program, like, as terrorists, as jihadis, that they want the movie to just be about how the war on terror was bad and was Islamophobic. And they don't like the fact that the movie does, and I think it does, the movie accepts the premise of the Saudi government in launching this facility, right? Like the Saudi government created this because they believe that there are people who have gotten involved in violent extremism, and the Saudi government believes that that is bad, and that they want to do something to reintegrate them into society. And a big turning point in the movie is when, not to give too many spoilers, but as I think most people know, there was a change of regime in Saudi Arabia a few years ago that led to a lot of changes in policy, including a different attitude toward this rehabilitative project. And it is just totally true, right? A factually accurate thing is that Meg Smaker, the filmmaker, she seems quite sympathetic to this Saudi project. She's not sympathetic to the Guantanamo Bay project.
Right. I mean, it definitely, look, it is a nuanced film where you, in my view, kind of understand these men through different lenses of I'm sympathetic, then I'm suddenly not sympathetic, et cetera, back and forth. But ultimately, you're right that she's very clear about, you get a sense of her feeling about Guantanamo. And the reason she spends a year and a half at this center is because she's interested in it, and she seems to think there's some kind of value in helping people return to normal life, because that's really what and you hear these men talking, and the things that they want to get out of this program are like, they want a job, they want to get married and have kids, they want to have families, and they have these aspirations that are actually quite, I mean, modest aspirations for what they want out of their lives. And you watch them, and clearly they have, they've been incarcerated in Guantanamo for 15 plus years, and they don't, how are they going to do that? And so the Saudi government is going to originally help them get a job and other things. And that changes midway through the movie. But yes, I'm just agreeing with you, I guess, is that her views, it's not like it's unclear what she thinks.
Well, and so I want to read this from the open letter. They say, even after 20 years of war on terror policies, including the use of torture, drone warfare, and the targeting of Muslim communities through discriminatory policies such as surveillance and travel bans, your most recent programming choice, Jihad Rehab, recycles harmful and Islamophobic narratives. And I think that that's an interesting claim, right? Because it's like you have to dig into why that is, right, in a specific sense. I think that a lot of the negative commentary about this movie is designed to make people think that she's doing apologia for Guantanamo Bay, that she's doing apologia for torture, and she isn't. I mean, she just isn't. What is true, though, is that she does not depict these four guys as wholly innocent victims. Right? She doesn't say the war on terror is made up hysteria. She has, in fact, repeated conversations with these men about September 11th. in which they all say things. I mean, they have different reactions to it, but some of them say, like, they didn't quite get what the big deal was. Others say, like, I came to be really ashamed that this happened. You know, there's one guy, one of the most sort of horrific torture stories that's in there is about a guy who was being tortured by American officials because they wanted him to tell them about his brother, who's a high-ranking al-Qaeda person in Yemen. And he's explaining horrific torture that he received, but it's happening because he's denying any family relationship with this guy. And then finally he sort of, quote unquote, confesses. I mean, it's of course not a crime to have a brother who's a terrorist, but he concedes that it was factually true that this guy was his brother. And his brother, like, really was a high-ranking leader in a terrorist organization who is himself eventually targeted and killed in a Trump administration drone strike. And then he says that he has very sort of mixed feelings about his brother, that he is angry that his brother dragged him into this life and that he doesn't think it's good, but also that he loves his brother and that you're not going to disavow family in that way. And I think, to me, as an audience member, like, that's really interesting filmmaking. It's like incredibly compelling human drama that explores, you know, the worst in people on both sides of a conflict, the dilemmas between, you know, impersonal ethics and family dynamics, et cetera, et cetera. But what is true is that this foregrounds the idea that Islamist terrorism is like a real thing, right? That, like, whatever you might say about Bush or Trump or Obama or drones or surveillance, that it wasn't, like, made up in some sense. There's another guy who explains, you know, getting, like, military training in Bosnia and going to Afghanistan to, like, join holy war. And nobody in the whole movie is like, aha, this is what all Muslims do. Like, it's the opposite. It's a Saudi-run facility to get people to not do that. But she's not delivering a sort of, like, hard left, easy answers, this is all fake sort of explanation. And that seems to be a big part of what's driving upset about this movie.
I think what was also interesting about the variety of men that she spoke to was she tried to get them each to talk about that period of time where they left home to join a camp in Afghanistan and train and fight. And they have varying degrees of wanting to talk about it. But what was clear was that they each had a different story of how they ended up in Afghanistan and why they did it. And that was also, to me, a confrontation of sort of a leftist view that all of these men who get involved in terrorism were poor, they had no prospects, and that's how they got involved. And it just didn't strike me as, when you hear the backstories of some of these men, that didn't seem to be the case, that they had different reasons and views that kind of got them there. And that also, to me, felt that the critique of this idea of Muslims being flattened, that sort of a flattening of a group of people, wasn't there. It sort of challenged me to think about why people do this. But like you said, it's predicated on the idea that this existed.
Part of what's interesting to me about this is that I think, like, how you read this movie politically will depend on what you think the baseline case is. Right? So to me, I think, like, most Americans probably believe that everyone in Guantanamo Bay absolutely deserved what they got.
Probably, yeah.
Right. I think that, like, the median state of American public opinion on this topic is, like, quite right-wing.
Right.
And that relative to where I think authentic public opinion is, I think this movie, if people saw it, would drag people's views to the left. That, like, what you would learn watching this movie is that a lot of the people imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay were literally teenagers.
This is the other issue I wanted to bring up, that he's 16.
A lot of young men around the world get mixed up in some shit of one sort or another without a great deal of thoughtfulness or like deep-seated ideological commitment. And we like rightly have like systems of laws and stuff to like discourage these kinds of things. But I think we normally understand that it's like what a person does when they're 16, 17 years old does not reflect the totality of their life or incredibly deeply rooted ideological commitment. Like one guy saying, it's like, I went to this place because like my brother was there and he was like, hey, you should come, right? And they were characterized, people who were picked up by American forces at the right time, as if they were like Osama bin Laden, right? Like these like incredible terrorism masterminds. And it's really wrong. It's like, it's hard to say exactly why all of these people got involved in what they did, but it's pretty clear that for most of them, it's just like it wasn't super thoughtful. And I just think if you come to the movie with the presumption that like everyone is a leftist academic, you're going to look at this movie and be like, wow, like this is so right wing. Like she says terrorism is bad and people should do something to stop it. But if you come at it with, I think what is like most people, I mean, like Donald Trump won an election, right? After saying he thought Muslims should be banned from entering the country. And relative to the actual opinion status quo, like I think this clarifies how shallow some of the involvement in these activities was, how much like real human beings lurk behind these stories, how much gross mistreatment people were subjected to at Guantanamo Bay, how much the departure from the concept of the rule of law created these like cascading problems where now like nobody knows what to do with these people who were picked up as teenagers because they were never afforded the benefit of a trial. Right. And they like now can't be. You can't ascertain in any real way what any of them did or didn't do. And then eventually the current Saudi government, you know, it doesn't want to let them go back home to Yemen, but it also doesn't want to employ them in Saudi Arabia. And like it seems really bad. Like you walk away sympathizing and like wishing these guys would be treated better. You know?
Well, and there were some moments where I was like, there was one character who he knew how to make bombs and he taught bomb making to other members of Al-Qaeda. And now he has a business with remote controls. And it was like, I was a little less sympathetic to him as it was like, So just to say, it is not a leftist film where you walk away like these people are good people at heart. It's more like people are complicated and it's hard to say. And one thing I did find striking, and I've been following the story of Guantanamo, but just these four guys, it just seems so random, really. It was like, man, it could have been anybody that got picked up and put in that position, right? Any sort of random low-level Al-Qaeda person could have gotten picked up. And, to your point that some of these guys were just teens thrown in there, and it seems like over the course of years they were tortured, and it's like, what information were you trying, like 4 years later, if you're still waterboarding someone and you're not getting it, like how good is their information 4 years later anyway? It just all seemed to me like cruel for no reason.
Wait, it's not like the guy knows where his brother is, and he's been in prison for years.
How would he know? And who would probably have a better idea would be like the CIA probably knows where his brother is. And I actually don't even think that was an issue. They kind of knew where he was. Yeah, I mean, the fact they killed him with a drone strike. Anyway, the point is that it was really, to me, even as somebody who's been following Guantanamo, the story of it, I don't know if you've ever heard voices, the actual prisoners. Over the years, there's been reports released with written descriptions of treatment, and I've read quotes from people in prison there. But this was the first time I really saw and heard somebody speaking. And that, to me,
absolutely,
as terms of filmmaking goes, giving these people who have been just anonymous faces for 20 years, a platform to speak was, I think, useful and good, and the role of independent filmmaking. You're not going to get that's what it required. So that's why I just reject the idea that this was solely a hurtful film, but I just see layers in which it added value in the world.
So let's take a break, and then I want to talk about a sort of another line of complaint that I think has maybe more validity to it. Okay. So another thing that they said in this open letter, which I think reveals sort of the sentiments that are often behind these cancellation controversies, is they just like zoom out and stop talking about Meg Smaker's movie. And they start talking about like what has been shown at Sundance over the years.
Yes.
And they say that, there have been 76 movies in the documentary competition that are sort of about Muslims or people from the Middle East, but only about a third of them were directed by Muslims or Middle Eastern filmmakers. And they say that, there have been 4 movies that are 4 documentaries about the Muslim experience in the United States, of which 2 are about the war on terror. And so now they're saying, like, not that there's anything wrong with this movie. I mean, they have their complaints with the movie, but I mean, they're talking now about what is the totality of what is shown at Sundance, not just in terms of a diversity of sort of creative personalities, but what is interesting to them, right? And particularly, I think it's striking the fact, so there have been 4 documentaries shown about the Muslim American experience, of which 2 are about the war on terrorism. And I think you can see, I mean, we don't work in documentary film, but like we work in media, right? And so there's a sense in which it seems intuitive to me that the war on terror experience would be something that American audiences have a lot of interest in. But then I can also see why, of course, the Muslim population in the United States is not that large. It's a small numerical minority, but it includes literally millions of people, the vast majority of whom have absolutely nothing to do with the war on terrorism. And it's true, I think, factually, that there is not a ton of like public curiosity about those communities and their lives, and not necessarily a ton of knowledge about it. And there are lots of other stories that one could be telling. I mean, you could be talking about Muslims whose family origins are in totally different parts of the world, but they now come together at a community mosque in a mid-sized city. You can make up lots of stuff, and it's true. We are just like, we're not hearing a lot about the full range of things that you could hear about.
And if you look at the role of a Sundance, that's kind of the idea, right? That a film that wouldn't necessarily, or in general, these are films that major distributors are not going to pick up. But that's the kind of concept, is that you can get a film noticed that covers a topic or an idea that wouldn't have a chance but for the system of independent film.
But that is where it gets a little hard to talk about, like, feature-length documentary films as a genre, because feature-length documentary filmmaking is such a kind of niche thing, right? I mean, we were talking before the show about like what documentaries have we enjoyed, and you mentioned Man on Wire.
A classic.
I mean, it came out a long time ago. It came out in 2008. But I also saw Man on Wire, because if I think about my whole lifetime, how many feature-length documentaries have I seen in movie theaters? Right. And it's probably, and I love movies. I'm like a huge like movie guy. I've got a Letterboxd account. I'm always doing posts up there. I've seen like maybe a dozen. In theaters, and some more at home.
Oh, in theaters. Yeah. I feel it's an at home. Yeah.
So when ones win the Oscar, I usually do definitely try to go see them at home. And when I was like single and had no kids and went to movies constantly, so if I look at the ones from when I was in my early 20s that have won, Fog of War, March of the Penguins, Inconvenient Truth, Taxi to the Dark Side, Man on Wire, The Cove, I saw all of those in theaters, but I don't do it so much sort of recently. And it's a very eccentric list, right? Like what we have in Oscar-winning documentary topics is like climate change, the war on terror, like a French guy who likes to walk on wires, something about dolphins, and so you'd be like, well, like how important is wire walking or dolphins to global society? And like, not that important. These just happen to be interesting movies.
Right.
It's just like, it's really hard to make a documentary that breaks through at all into mass culture, which is different from like a cop show, which like we just have all the time.
I will also say super niche things can make really interesting stories because of the specificity. I watched the David Koresh documentary on Netflix. Very disturbing. And I mean, it is a cult, but it's a large cult, but still, it's not representative of mainstream Mormonism in the United States. It's a cult. So, and that's why the whole thing is weird. That's why it's interesting to watch. So I get what you're saying on that front. I also think that the request of the open letter would make more sense to me if the conclusion was, we want a fellowship in which a Muslim filmmaker has an opportunity once a year, something that would create a pathway into Sundance, into the independent film making industry for somebody. But that's not what they're asking. They're asking that for an apology about a film that was made rather than creating any kind of avenue to have more films, which I think is actually what these filmmakers want.
Yeah, I mean, it's challenging, I mean, I think that a lot of these controversies you wind up kind of mixing and matching, concerns about discrimination with concerns about talent pipelines and career support, and then concerns about specific movies that you didn't like, or I shouldn't just say movies, like works, right? And it all kind of gets blended together in a sort of an odd way in which, it doesn't, like, one question, right, is like, does it on net help representation of Muslim filmmakers to establish the precedent that if a non-Muslim white American person makes a movie, which, I mean, I believe had a Saudi producer and a Yemeni producer, she was working with, she had lived in Yemen for Yemen for years. She speaks Arabic. I mean, she has real ties to this part of the world and has people from that part of the world working on the film. Does it advance the cause of representation or hurt it to kind of like salt the earth around this subject matter, which I think is a little bit of a kind of an undecided issue. I mean, if I think of a documentary that I liked a lot, came out 10 years ago, called The Act of Killing. It's about Indonesia, and the director is a American guy, or he's British, and he's working mostly with Danish people. It's a kind of a Danish production. Very few, and you could say on an obvious level, it's like, well, but why are these Europeans telling this story about Indonesia, right? Like, why don't Indonesians tell it? And the reason is that they are explaining an event in Indonesian history that people in the West like don't know anything about to an English language audience, right? They're like translating these facts about Indonesia to an audience that they themselves understand. And it's a very good movie, but I mean, I had some real discomfort with it on that level, that it's like, why do I need to get my information about this from a British person? But it's in part because there like genuinely aren't any like prominent Indonesian origin people working in English language media, or certainly weren't 10 years ago, not people who I knew. And so all of my information about Indonesia, there was a good book called The Jakarta Method that came out a couple years ago. It's written by an American, and it's about the American government's involvement in this country. And that's just sort of like, is how people get information about things, is like from people who exist in the media spaces that they are paying attention to. And how do you sort of change that or alter it in a systematic way? How do you create more opportunities for people to get their hooks into like the existing distribution and production system? I think is a harder question than just being like, oh, don't do this, like that movie was bad. Because it's like, it's hard to make a movie. Like, it requires money and experience, access to equipment.
Well, I do think that it is fair to critique an existing film for sure. And that gives you entree into a broader conversation. But like you're saying, deleting a film that was made, how does that advance the cause of filmmakers, other types of filmmakers? And that was a hang up for me when I was looking at this letter, that there's an opportunity to attempt to, get something for filmmakers who are often excluded. So I guess I'm agreeing with you on that. One other issue I have with questions of representation is that, okay, so I don't want to get too far off track, but for example, Serial was back in the news recently. The main character has been released. It looks like he'll probably not be retried. The thing that bothered me about that series was the way in which a narrative about kind of air quote good men, that men who seem, educated and have their lives together and have families, that they couldn't be abusers, that there were actual quotes from the podcast producer about this. And what bothered me about it is that it was a popular show solidifying a narrative that is really hurtful. And so I want to at least acknowledge that, would it be better if Serial was never made? I don't know. It was made, so what am I going to do, But I wished that this popular series hadn't hardened what I think is a damaging storyline in the world, because we're talking about hurt and harm, and I don't want to say that I know for certain how somebody else watching the film that I'm watching would interpret the presentation of these guys that were held in Guantanamo. So I do have some sympathy around the idea that creating something popular that advances a narrative that is truly hurtful. This is the idea that, oh, he looks like a credible man. That's a reason why domestic violence perpetuates. And so I just want to say I have some sympathy for this idea of confirming attitudes and beliefs. Me watching Jihad Rehab, which I should also note that the name of it has been changed. It's now called Unredacted. That some people were, she was criticized that even by people who liked the film. One LA Times writer, a Muslim woman herself, she liked the film and wrote about it, but said that the title of it didn't do the film justice. So it's now called Unredacted, that she changed the name of it. But that's sort of what I grapple with on this. And the other thing is, in terms of the Serial example, it was a woman who didn't see the problem that she was perpetuating. So it's not, I sometimes think that somebody who's not part of a community can be really helpful in exposing problems in our world, that like a perspective not from within can be helpful. Maybe that would have made a difference if somebody was listening to her show who, I don't know. I'm not sure, but that comes up a lot.
I mean, I guess, there's this like slightly odd discourse around harm, right, that has started floating around, and that I think, features prominently in the Sundance apology, right? And I always feel torn between sort of two kind of extremes, right? There's like a real like free speech bro, kind of view that's like words can't harm people, like you should never say something like that. And I think like that's wrong, right? Like works of art, works of journalism, statements have impact on the world, and that impact can be a harmful impact. And it is a totally reasonable like frame of critique to be like, I think that if a lot of people see this, if a lot of people listen to this, if a lot of people read this, that will cause bad things to happen in the world, and it is harmful. At the same time, I do think we have to acknowledge that sort of like discourse harms are different from like I harm you by punching you in the face.
Well, I think harm and hurt are different, right? Like, or even feeling bad. I watched this film, and at the end of it, I felt bad. As an American, I felt ashamed. But that's not, I'm hurt. It's, I feel bad, which is a distinction.
But also, A categorical rule against people punching each other is like that's a good rule, right? Like we can try to run a society without interpersonal violence. We can't try to run a society in which nobody ever releases a documentary that like some large group of people think the political point of is wrong.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like that doesn't work, right? Like there's a group of people who would tell you that an inconvenient truth was very harmful, right? Like people who have like right-wing opinions about climate policy. And then there's other people who will say, well, that movie was very beneficial. And you can't have a world in which people don't like try to make impactful cultural works on contentious issues. We have to be able to have a like a debate about them, right? In which like some people say, I didn't like this movie. I thought that it perpetuates X, Y, and Z. And other people say like, no, I think you're wrong. I think the movie raised good points, things like that. The theory that like how is Sundance going to, on an ongoing basis, have a documentary film competition if every time a movie comes out and some people organize and do a sign-on letter and they're like, no, actually that movie was bad, they say, oh, I'm sorry that we harmed people, right? Like this is, you know, like it's a good movie. You know, it raises a lot of questions. It explores some complexities. Not everybody needs to love it. I liked it a lot. I thought my main complaint with it is about the frequent use of these like shots of pigeons in slow motion, which is nothing to do with the politics of it.
We talked about this. That was my main critique, was the pigeons taking flight. But I was like, is this a metaphor? I don't even understand why we keep seeing these. But in any case, there's different, that is a critique of a film and choices of the filmmaker.
There should be a high bar.
There needs to be a very high bar for what this is. And there has not been a clear articulation of what the harm of this film was. It's really, to me, been held up as a sort of metaphor for what is missing, or a sort of metaphor for a type of film or genre of film. And that doesn't clear that bar for me personally. I don't see how this film does that.
I think that on some level, like most documentary filmmakers are left-wing in their political opinions. Right. That's just like, that it is what it is. Like that's how it works. And I think that you see this dynamic in a lot of different spaces, right? Whether it's documentary film, it's academia, it's like dance and theater, right? They're just occupational categories where most of the people doing it are on the left. So you can kind of gin up these micro panics about some work coming out that's like not 100% like dogmatic leftist in its content. And people will say, okay, you know, like we've got to shut this down. And other people who have sort of more mixed feelings or like a boring opinion, like I haven't seen the movie, so I can't really opine on this, don't want to like intervene and make trouble because they know which way the winds are blowing. And in this case, I mean, I think this is a good specific case because like, I just like, this is not a right-wing movie. You know, like you have to come to it from a very left-wing place to even see the possibility that like this is war on terror propaganda. Like I think it just like reflects erroneous, like you and I, if we have any real expertise, it's like not in documentary filmmaking or in Middle Eastern representation. It's in like American politics.
Right.
And I think the people who think that this movie is going to do political harm are just like, they're making a mistaken judgment about what American politics is like. Like, I think that if everybody went and saw this movie, it would actually advance the causes that the people complaining about this movie care about.
Right.
They're just like, they're misjudging the situation.
If you showed this film at the RNC, right, you're like, okay, we're going to have a screening of this. I think the right would be pissed because it's like we are humanizing.
They're criticizing Trump's buddy. They're humanizing
these people who committed, as far as extra legal, judicious crimes, and are now being released and being helped. And this is ridiculous. But I mean, that's not, we don't live in a moment where a documentary film is being sort of critiqued at the RNC. So, I mean, this would just be my guess that this is sort of, if your starting point is, look, we locked up a bunch of bad guys in Guantanamo and it's now difficult to figure out what to do with them, and you just don't have much sympathy for, well, you were engaged in activities that directly led to the events of 9/11. I just don't have much sympathy for you. That feels like a very common, I mean, we just know that is a very common view in America. And I don't think that's not like a far right view. That's like a mainstream view. And so it would be just a useful film to see and to sort of think about, maybe that's still your position at the end of the film, but it's just sort of interesting to think about, and also to think about American policy and, was this the best choice? It challenges Americans who are interested in politics to think about their positions.
Absolutely.
And that's just another way to see it.
So thumbs down.
Thumbs down.
To this take from the Sundance Festival. Don't apologize.
Don't apologize. I guess you can tell how anxious I am, because I'm like, what if I'm missing something? But I think that there's been enough opportunity for critics to lay out what their problem is with this actual film, and I have not seen a really credible explanation for what the harm would be. So that's why I'm a thumbs down. And
by all means, look, Sundance, if there's like more you can do to promote like some different kinds of movies on different subjects from different kinds of filmmakers, like great, but like don't apologize for showing this one. So, okay, Bad Takes, production of Grid. Our producer is Olivia Reingold. We thank her as always. We thank all of you who've been listening to the show. We hope that if you have not yet rated and reviewed it, shared it with your friends and family, do that. We're trying to build an audience here. We're out here trying to hustle, trying to get you more takes. I also want to thank Meg Smaker for sharing a screener copy with us that let us have an actual informed discussion about this. So appreciate that. And we'll be back next week with more Bad Takes.